Welcome to a deep dive into this stack of your sources surrounding the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
Definitely. We've got materials detailing the recent events, key statements, and, well, quite different perspectives on what might happen next.
Our mission today really is to cut through some of that noise.
Exactly. Extract the most important insights from these sources, help you get a clear picture quickly. It's developing so fast.
And the U.S. role is obviously crucial.
Absolutely. Complex dynamics there. Okay, let's dive in.
And it's a situation that, it's shifted dramatically, almost instantly, it feels like.
Right.
Looking at the timeline in the sources, it's pretty striking. You have June 12th, this statement attributed to Donald Trump.
The one about diplomacy.
Yeah. We remain committed to a diplomatic resolution to the Iran nuclear issue. Very clear.
Publicly, yes. But what the sources really highlight is that incredibly rapid turn, according to the materials, within hours of that statement.
Israel attacked Iran.
Boom. Just like that.
That's the critical pivot point, isn't it? From there, the conflict just ramps up. The sources detail Iran responding, hitting Israeli cities.
With waves of missiles and drones, yeah.
Ballistic missiles, drones.
The works. And Israel hitting back. The reports mention Israeli warplanes targeting Tehran's air defense systems, apparently for a second night running.
That's what's mentioned. And crucially, the sources state Israel also struck Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordo and Isfahan,
claiming significant damage. And the material also notes, importantly, that more Israeli attacks could still be coming.
Yeah, it doesn't sound finished. And one of the sort of immediate takeaways from these sources is that the U.S., well, it isn't just watching from the sidelines.
No, America's forces were already involved, weren't they? Defending Israel against those incoming strikes.
They were. The materials give specifics. On June 13th, it says U.S. ground-based missile batteries and a U.S. Navy destroyer were actively shooting down Iranian projectiles.
Both land and sea assets involved?
Right. And beyond that direct defense, the sources suggest U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, was likely involved too.
How so?
Well, likely helping Israel track the Iranian ballistic missile launches, using those American infrared satellites, spotting the heat signatures from space.
Okay, so U.S. military assets, U.S. capabilities, already engaged in the situation.
Definitely engaged.
What's also really clear from these documents you shared is that Mr. Trump, he wasn't totally surprised by this, was he? The material indicates he had some advance warning.
Yes. The sources point to a meeting, his foreign policy team at Camp David, June 8th, specifically to discuss this looming Iran crisis.
And it mentions tension within that team, too.
Yeah, highlights that split between sort of the hawks and the isolationists.
And Trump himself was talked directly to Netanyahu, right? Calls noted on June 9th, the 12th.
Again, on the 13th, right after the first wave of attacks happened, so lots of communication there.
The sources also mentioned something about the U.S. embassy in Iraq.
Partially evacuated on June 11th. Another signal, perhaps, that they anticipated trouble brewing in the region.
And what's really striking is Trump's view after the Israeli attacks started. The material quotes him giving an endorsement.
Yeah, saying things like, I think it's been excellent. We gave them the chance and they didn't take it. Even reportedly boasting, I always knew the date.
So despite that June 12th statement pushing diplomacy,
right,
the sources show there was prior knowledge, discussions, and then this post-attack endorsement. And all this military action was unfolding while U.S. diplomacy with Iran was, well, officially still supposed to be happening.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The sources describe this parallel U.S. diplomatic effort. The next round of U.S.-Iran talks, led by Steve Witkoff, they were scheduled for June 15th in Oman.
But the feeling was those talks were already in trouble.
The assessment in the sources, is that those talks had lost momentum. And, the material presents a perspective that Israel, described as hostile to an Iran deal,
right,
was still probably keen to act before any potential agreement could actually be reached.
Timing is everything, I guess.
And this view maybe gets some backing from reports in the sources on June 14th. An Iranian official is quoted basically dismissing the U.S.-Iran negotiations as meaningless.
Wow. So that door might be slamming shut.
It suggests that diplomatic channel the U.S. hoped to keep open. It might be effectively closing down as the fighting ramps up.
Okay, so given the U.S. military is already defending Israel, the big question that jumps out from the source material is, could America get pulled in even deeper?
That's the core issue now, I think. initially, the sources describe a picture of maybe American ambivalence about a wider war.
What do they mean by that?
Well, like in mid-May, the U.S. military setup didn't really look like it was geared for a full-scale regional conflict. They'd moved an aircraft carrier out
Right.
and swapped out advanced B-2 bombers for older B-52s. The sources flogged this as maybe indicating they weren't on an immediate war footing.
But then things changed.
But then the materials highlight a pretty significant shift in posture. It suggests America might actually be preparing for deeper involvement.
How so? What changed?
They mentioned the U.S. rushing destroyers, those warships, often key for missile defense or offense to the Middle East.
Sending in more ships. Oh, okay.
And maybe even more telling. The USS Nimitz, that's an aircraft carrier. It was in the Pacific, reportedly canceled a port visit to Vietnam.
Suggesting.
The sources suggest this could very well mean it's heading west, towards the Middle East, which would be a substantial boost in U.S. military presence and capability in the region.
And the sources also lay out specific ways the U.S. could help Israel more, right? Possibly getting more directly involved in the fight.
Yeah, they outline a few possibilities. One is simply providing more real-time intelligence, giving Israel better info on Iranian targets, movements, that kind of thing.
Okay, intelligence sharing. What else?
Refueling Israeli jets in midair.
Which sounds technical, but what does that actually allow Israel to do?
Well, the sources say it gives them more dwell time over Iran, meaning their planes can stay on mission longer, fly deeper into Iran, hit targets without needing to return to base quite so quickly. Extends their reach and endurance.
Right, makes sense. And then there's the really big one, the heavy bombers.
This is a key point from the materials.
Yeah.
America could potentially join the campaign with its heavy bombers, carrying those massive 30,000-pound bombs.
Bunker busters, basically.
Exactly. The significance, as explained in the sources, is that these bombs are designed to penetrate much deeper underground than most normal bombs before they detonate.
Which matters because of targets like Fordo.
Precisely. The sources mention Fordo, the enrichment plant, is buried deep underground, and the assessment presented is that Israel, well, it might not have the capability to destroy Fordo completely just with its own conventional bombing.
So the calculation might be.
But the sources suggest Israel might be calculating, or perhaps hoping, that America could then be persuaded to step in and help finish the job, using those specialized heavy bombs to hit that deeply buried facility.
Okay, so the potential for the U.S. to shift from just defending Israel to actively joining the offensive, it seems very real based on these sources, especially for those really tough targets.
It does. But the sources also flag the other side of that coin, the risk of being pulled in deeper because of how Iran might retaliate.
Ah, right. The Iranian response. What do the sources say about that?
Well, they note that Iran's ability to hit Israel directly might be somewhat limited. So that could push Tehran to consider other options.
Options that might involve the U.S. more directly.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
The paths mentioned include hitting American targets in the region, maybe trying to spook Mr. Trump, or just force a U.S. reaction.
Or using proxies.
Exactly. Intensifying attacks using groups like the Houthis against shipping in the Red Sea. That's already been happening, of course.
Something even bigger.
A more drastic scenario presented is Iran trying to close the Strait of Hormuz, that vital oil choke point, or attacking energy facilities in the Gulf.
Which would send oil prices
Through the roof.
Yeah.
Immediate global economic impacts.
Yeah. And layered on top of all this immediate military back and forth, there's this bigger ambition mentioned, isn't there, from Netanyahu?
Yes. The sources note that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated pretty explicitly on June 13th that the strikes were, in his words, clearing the path for the overthrow of the Iranian regime.
Wow. That's a huge goal, regime change.
Massive. And potentially transformative, of course.
Whoa.
But the sources also highlight the potential fallout if the Iranian regime were to collapse.
Yeah.
Well, the sources say Mr. Trump may not be able to escape the resulting chaos, and that chaos could easily threaten U.S. interests, U.S. allies throughout the region. It's a huge unknown.
And this potential outcome, this whole unfolding situation, it really stands in stark contrast to a vision Mr. Trump apparently laid out just a month before, right, in Saudi Arabia.
It does. According to the source material, he spoke then about a Middle East golden age, one defined by commerce, not chaos.
Focused on trade.
Investment. Yeah, saying American policy would be based on that, and he explicitly decried Western intervention. A very different tune.
Although one interpretation offered in the sources sort of tries to square that circle, doesn't it?
How so?
It suggests that joining Israel's attack now could maybe be seen as a transformative moment, a way to hasten that golden age by weakening or even ending the Iranian regime, which the source describes as having, caused mayhem beyond its borders for decades.
So short-term intervention for long-term stability. That's one way to frame it, I suppose.
But as the sources also caution, the Middle East, well, it has a habit of shattering those kinds of grand plans, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Which brings us right to the core dilemma facing Mr. Trump, who the material describes as ever ambivalent on getting entangled overseas.
Okay, so lay out that dilemma as the sources see it.
On one hand, they suggest going all in, with Israel providing full military support, including those heavy bombers, could potentially shorten the conflict, help destroy key nuclear sites quickly.
Get it over with, maybe.
Maybe. Yet, the clear warning presented is that doing precisely that could also escalate things dramatically, risk exposing America to another forever war in the region.
The exact thing he campaigned against.
Right. And we should probably touch on the U.S. domestic politics here, too, which the sources mention.
Okay. What's the picture there?
Republicans are described as being broadly supportive of Israel and of American assistance. The material quotes Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, saying on June 13th, Israel eyes right and has a right to defend itself. Pretty clear support.
But not universal support.
Well, the sources also acknowledge potential backlash, specifically among some May-J movement members described as being hostile to foreign interventions.
And they mentioned that old video clip.
Yeah, an old clip of Trump himself circulating where he was criticizing Barack Obama's Iran policy, saying something like, "Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate."
Highlights the tricky political tightrope he might be walking domestically, too.
Definitely adds another layer of complexity to the decision-making.
Okay, so let's try and pull together the key insights from all these materials you've shared. We've seen this incredibly rapid escalation.
Triggered almost immediately after a U.S. statement about diplomacy.
Right. U.S. involvement in defending Israel. Already happening.
While that formal diplomacy seems to be, well, fading fast.
And multiple paths exist for this whole conflict to get much wider, much bigger, potentially pulling America in much deeper.
Including that very ambitious stated Israeli goal of regime change in Iran.
Understanding these specific dynamics, all pulled directly from these source materials, it feels crucial right now. Because, as the sources themselves remind us, the Middle East has a way of, well, upending even the best-laid plans.
And the consequences of this particular conflict could ripple out far beyond just the immediate region. Global impacts are very possible.
Which really leads us to a final important question for you, the listener, to consider. Based on everything we've unpacked from the sources today, given Mr. Trump's apparently contradictory signals, the public diplomacy talk versus the advanced knowledge and the thumbs up afterwards.
And the current U.S. defensive role versus the potential for deep offensive involvement, maybe even with those heavy bombers.
And then balancing the risk of regional chaos against the possibility of achieving some kind of transformative moment. What single factor out of all of that do you think is most likely to be the decisive one? The one that ultimately determines just how deeply the United States gets drawn into this conflict, something to mull over?